Hello everybody, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today it's our third episode and we will be building beans. Probably this is one of the most important episodes when you are learning Spring Boot because we will target how to build beans, how to hire them, and how to use a little bit inversion of control. I will not explain in too much detail how it works behind the scenes. That will be the subject for a further episode. But for now, we will just want to create a service layer in our application, meaning the place where we will be developing our business. So what we want is on this REST controller that we built in our latest episode. So we have this method called say hello, just return the string, and another method that it's called say goodbye. Just an example, but in the future we'll change, of course, the name to get users or something like that. But when the address has users in the suffix, we just return an instance of the user, and with that we can check the result that will be JSON with two properties, username and password. In this episode, I would like to introduce beans, meaning that we want to create an additional class to serve the user's business logic. Let's call it user service. I already created the class. You can, for instance, pause the video, just write this code. It's the only thing that I did from the previous version. And I put here the methods that were in our REST controller, like this one. So it's not a good practice to have business logic on the REST controller. The REST controller, it's the layer in the architecture responsible for the protocols, for the input validation, formatting, serialization with the external world. In our case, it's HTTP, and we are using REST API. So that will be the concern for this layer. And since it's a controller, one of the responsibilities is to find where the business logic exists and call the methods from there. So in our case, the business logic will exist in this class user service. So I wrote here the method say hello that returns the same that we can see here, and I'm returning the same here for the users, and I just change name to get user by ID. Int ID here, it will be necessary, but it's not useful at this time because our model about user doesn't have an ID yet, and maybe later probably will change to something like string username or email or something like that when the user has more, let's say, real business attributes. Okay, so this is our business. Of course, I'm not at this time targeting a good software engineering approach. For instance, say hello doesn't make any sense to be on user service. Probably there will be a different service for that, call it, let's say, welcome service. But usually this kind of services and controllers only exist in demos. In enterprise, it's almost impossible from the decision point of view to have a method called say hello. Maybe an echo to test or a ping to make sure that the API it's working. But today we have other ways using observability to check if the APIs are working or not. But since I'm doing this series step by step, so you understand the decisions that are being done and why are we taking these decisions. So there will be sometimes a lot of noise, bad practice in the middle, but in time we will be targeting a good refactoring and the code will be more code cleaner. Okay, so let's target this get user by ID. So we receive an ID, as I said before, but we are just returning a common user. It will not make sense to create a method called get user by what, right? So I wrote by ID. If it's by ID, I just had a parameter, but it will not be necessary for our demo. If you don't want to use it, please, no problem. I will not change this business code in this video. So let's return to our hello REST controller, and later again this will be an hello REST controller, and I am almost sure that this method will migrate to a different controller. Call it for instance users REST controller. That's the way to do it. But for now, let's just target how to build beans, and then we'll refactor later. Refactor, it's after things being done. It doesn't exist such thing as pre-refactoring. Okay, it's just refactor what already exists, and we know, and it's common. You start with the code that works. Maybe you should add a comment if you are in an enterprise environment and say refactor later, and maybe you can create even if you are using Agile, a card in your Kanban board saying refactor this REST controller and split into, for instance. It's a good practice and it's how it should be done. Okay, so let's return to our code. So what we want here, we want to instantiate the user service, okay, in the Hello REST controller and call this business logic. Of course, here we'll remove this code and replace it with a call to user service. So I will start with not with the Spring Boot approach, but the approach that is usually done in a common project, so people understand how Spring Boot those things. If you already know, okay, the rest of the video will be to teach about the beans and how to do a kind of inversion of control. But I will start step by step so people understand. I'm doing this because sometimes even when I'm learning on YouTube or other videos, sometimes the person that is teaching knows a lot about the subject, but sometimes it just skips small steps that where the beginner person or the person that wants to learn wanted to understand that they exist. And sometimes they just write the final code, but they don't understand why. And for me, the why it's very important. That's why sometimes my videos take longer than I expect, but I really like to explain things in detail so people know my mindset, the steps that I'm using when I'm thinking about things. So let's start here. Let's start with the common way to approach this. Let's say create a constructor, hello constructor. No, it's not like that. Sometimes I have Copilot installed and sometimes they propose things. I really like to use AI in my projects, but be careful, they hallucinate a lot. So I think it's a good tool, AI, but as a kind of extending, an extension helper for you. Don't take it for granted that their code is the right one. You should know what do you want and take advantage of the proposals that the AI can give you, but don't expect to do everything. Of course, there are great examples on the internet. They say, okay, I can build an entire application with AI. Yeah, but okay, now change it, try it to understand the code. So I don't like that approach. I like the approach of it. Okay, I know what I want. I just want these small things, and in these kind of things, they shine. It's really good, but be careful. I think we should go on that path about AI, but use it as a tool, not as a replacement. Otherwise, you will have problems in the future for sure. So we want the service. So let's start with private user service, okay, and let's instantiate here user service, and we are creating our constructor. So now here we can just take advantage of this and say user service, say hello. And here doing the same thing, return user service and get user ID. Just put 0. It's not relevant, the parameter, as I said before. So now we have a two-layer architecture at this time. I mean, we have a controller and we have a service. Of course, we don't have yet a data layer or database. It is something that I have planned to insert. But for now, we're just targeting the how to manage beans. So this should work. It works, and if I just run this application, where is my main? Okay, it's here. Let's play, run. Wait a moment, okay. Okay, so what can we see here? It's the start of a Spring Boot. If you saw my previous video, you understand most of these lines. So, but the most important is listened on port 8080 here using HTTP. Our application is on the root of the address, and it was quite well. Something that is really interesting that I'll return later in the future is this initializing Spring Dispatch Servlet. This Dispatch Servlet, it's a Java servlet. I will not explain what is a servlet at this time, but think as the components that are in front of a web application. And Spring has one, and this is the Spring component responsible to understand all these annotations and every decision that is taken when the application is being initialized. And it will be very important in a moment. Okay, so How do we know if our application is running? I'm just putting here, if I call hello, it should return hello. Why? Because our REST controller has this hello. And if we call users here, okay, and for users, okay, we'll just put the browser more visible. So, okay, let's put it here so we can switch, just clicking the mouse here. So now if we write users here, and you can see that username and password, that is the return of this method. So this should work. It works as a simple Java application, but it's not the Spring way. What is the problem? The problem is that we are instantiating a user service here, and then you put on the controller. Okay, that's okay. But the problem is Spring Boot understands this class. He knows about this class. How? Because this dispatcher servlet understands all these annotations here when the application is being initialized. But it doesn't know about this user service because the user service doesn't have any annotation on it. If it doesn't have annotation, Spring doesn't know it. It considers it's a kind of a POJO class. It's just a class that we are using as a utility in our project. What is the problem with that? There are a lot of services that we'll be using in the future that Spring can apply to a lot of instances and a lot of classes, but it can only apply when specific annotations exist on those classes, because the dispatcher servlet, when the application is running, when it receives the application is initializing, it looks for this kind of classes that annotated with Spring annotations. And for those that exist, it internally creates a big graph with the relations between them. And for the others, it doesn't know about them because there is no way it can guess what is the purpose of those classes. So Spring doesn't know nothing about user service. Of course, there is business logic here. But imagine that something that I will not go into detail, but for instance, Spring supports transactions. And I could put here annotation transaction. But since the class doesn't have a Spring annotation, this annotation will be just ignored, because this class will not be managed by Spring. And usually the class managed by Spring are the bins. That's the main concept on the Spring, are the bins. So we should add an annotation so the user service class can be known by Spring. And there are several ones. One that we can use, it's component. Component, it's the main annotation for classes in Spring. Almost all annotations came from component. If you go to a REST controller here, for instance, you can see that you have this, the annotation REST controller belongs to another annotation, which is controller. Okay, controller is usually used for web, and the controller is an interface that it's, let's say, inherit somehow. It's not very accurate what I'm saying about annotations, but what I can say is the controller is a component, okay? The component, it's the main annotation from Spring. And, okay, this is the main annotation for all the annotations in Spring. So when you are using a REST controller here, behind the scenes, you have a component. So if I put a component here, this class can be used by Spring. And what can we do now? Since this class is already Spring knows about this class, this component, so we can take advantage of some services that Spring provides us. For instance, in the REST controller, if I have this private here, but imagine that I put something like here, like user service, and rather than using this new, I would just put user service here. Of course, here I have to put this. And I don't instantiate this class anymore. Why? Because since we are having this notation here, Springs will instantiate this bin for us, okay, this class for us. I will use the name bin because the classes that are managed by Spring are called bin. So when I say bin, it means that it's a class that Spring knows about it. So when I put it here on the constructor, okay, as a parameter, what happens is this class is annotated by the REST controller. If you think for a while, we never instantiate this class. Okay, if we go to the main, you can see there is no new REST controller here. There is no hello REST controller because it is instantiated by Spring. And when Spring will instantiate this class, you'll see this, okay, I will call the constructor because constructors are used to create classes in Java. And it says, okay, there is a dependency in here. The only way to create this REST controller is if I can create this class, user service. And we will look for class that are beans, meaning that when he scanned at the start of the application for class, he found that there is a user's interface here that can be used in the parameter here. So you will create an instance of this class, okay, by calling this constructor, which is implicitly here, the default constructor. Of course, if this user service needs another class, another bean, it will be the same. So there will be a kind of a cascade instantiation. So now you understand how Spring does these things. If you now at the data layer, you create a class, you annotate with component. Of course, there are specific annotations for these layers that I will talk about them later. But for now, we are using component because it's the default one, and I think it should be known by everyone when they are using Spring Boot annotations. But you can create a class for the data, and when Spring tries to create a REST controller, because of this constructor, you will create an instance of this one, and if this one has a constructor also with dependencies, it will try to find them and instantiate them. This is called dependency injection. It's a common pattern used in Spring and usually in modern frameworks. It is called dependency injection because there is a dependency that should be injected in our case. In our case, it's a dependency called the user service that should be injected by Spring. Okay, and since it's not our code building the instance, creating the instance, we are delegating this to Spring. That's why you have an inversion of control, meaning that you don't control when the instances are created. It's inversed. It's the Spring that are doing that for you. That's why this kind of frameworks follow these two patterns that sometimes we take as one, which is dependency injection and inversion of control. Because if you have dependency injection, it should be the container that is managing that dependency injection that should create. So there is a kind of inversion of control. That's why these are two patterns, but at the same time, it's one common pattern because they work very closely between them. So we have now the user service, and we are not using new. And let's see if our application works. Okay, let's stop this. There is a way to avoid this stopping. I will talk about in another video. So let's run again. Run. Let's see if it works. Now we have two beans. Okay, if everything is okay. Okay, it was really fast. And now let's see if it's still working. Okay, we can see the result here. Hello. And it's still working. Okay, you can see that even without the new, so it was not we that created the instance, the Spring Boot injected by default here. There are other ways to inject this. For instance, probably it is possible not to use a constructor, just to put here a specific annotation and don't use the constructor, or even using methods like set. But the most common approach and the better one is using constructor, because the constructor reflects the requirements of a class. That's how I see constructors. When you have a constructor with parameters, what we are saying is the requirements to build this class, to create an instance, are this one. So for me, this is the best way. It is, if you have only one constructor, it's optional, but usually you will see in most Spring Boot applications the auto wire. If I put auto wire here and remove here from the constructor, it will work the same. The Spring Boot will detect there is an annotation, auto wired, and it will detect this annotation because the class it's annotated. I saw a lot of people doing this mistake of putting annotations in methods, but forgetting at least to put component here. For instance, even if it's not a REST control, at least to be a component. And if it's a component, all the Spring Boot will try to find annotations in the methods and properties. But if the class is not annotated, it will just be ignored. Okay, but return to this auto-wire. Auto-wired is instructing Spring Boot to say, find the parameters here okay, that the classes that are in these parameters here, and create an instance of them and inject on the parameter. And then it's our responsibility, of course, to take this instance, because the only thing that Spring does is just to create an instance and pass as a parameter on the constructor. It is our responsibility to take this instance and keep locally in our class. Okay, but as I was saying, AutoWire can be here also. But when we only have one constructor, it's optional, and that's why I remove it. But I can just put it here. So sometimes people, okay, it's Spring, but I don't see the AutoWire, because when there is only one constructor, it's optional. All the parameters will be considered dependencies that should be injected in this constructor. Okay, but I will put it here, and I always like to write to make it clear what is my intention with that code. And my intention here is just to do dependency injection and use a service component. It's enough, but it's good practice when you have a business class to change to service. Okay, it's the same purpose. For now, we can change to service here. Import class, I'll remove the component. And because service targets services, okay, business logic. And sometimes, not in our example, we don't see any advantage of that, because there isn't. But sometimes there are specific annotations that service, repository, and things like that that Spring has, that when Spring is initializing, it takes that specific annotation into consideration and initialize other service that can be applied to class that are annotated with that annotation. And that's one of the main things that's why it exists, service and component. But if you have a class, for instance, that you only want to have specific methods with specific annotations, for instance, for transaction things and other things that we learn in Spring Boot, usually component it's enough. Okay, is enough to use it. But if it's in the business part, it's better to use service. As for instance, in data layers, you have GPA, Hibernates, and things like that. It's a data layer, so there is specific annotations like repository or GPA repository that helps Spring to understand the purpose of that class, and it can improve your code or provide you better services for testing, for identifying class, for transactional exceptions, and so on. Yeah, that's the reason behind the annotations. But at the end of the day, don't forget that both are components. I saw we see it on the REST controller. Here it's the same. Can we see that service inherits somehow from the component? Okay, it's the same thing. But as I said, when the Spring is initializing, you will take into consideration it's a service, and you'll provide different services. Let's say, okay, I'm repeating the word, but it's semantically different. It will provide services to our service class. Okay, and that's what we are doing here. Okay, so change to service. It works. It's the same thing. It will be recognized by Spring. And at this time, I think it's enough for this lesson. We already have a REST controller. We already know how to inject. We already know how to create an additional bin, and we don't have to create the bin because it will be created by the Spring Boot container, and it will be injected here because we have this annotation, but mostly because this is the only constructor and we are injecting here. And again, we are not seeing any new of the class. Everything is created by Spring. This is one of the advantage by Spring. I know I talk a lot here about this. I wanted to be very clear because, as I said before, this is one of the most important episodes that you can have when you are learning Spring Boot. It's this concept of dependency injection, inversion of control. I will go into more details in further videos about the different options to inject these. Best practice, we shouldn't use directly a class. Maybe you should create the class but have an interface and use the interface here. It's also possible, but that will be the subject for the next videos. I hope you have learned something from this. I hope for you now it is clear what is Spring Boot and what are the advantages. And with just 3 lessons, you already know how to create a Spring Boot, how to create a REST controller to respond to API calls, at least with simple calls. At this time, I didn't introduce any parameters on the addresses or on the URLs from the requests, and you already know how to create a bean for service. And if you want, you can create at this time a data layer and use JDBC as a database, and you can start to use directly Spring Boot with just only these 3 episodes. For sure, I will create videos for the data layer and how to connect automatically to database. This is something that Spring Boot has also that we can take advantage of. But at this time, I think if you know a little bit of Java, if Java is not new for you on Spring Boot, at this time you already have tools to create a 3-layer architecture, a simple one, and you can use the same concept. Use component for a user's database, for instance, here, and rather than use service, just write component, and you already have a 3-layer architecture. Okay, I hope you learned from this, and I'll see you on my next video, sure.